I wanted to talk a little bit about the whole many fine people statement Trump made some 8 years ago, and also talk a little bit about the Biden Trump debate. Now, in both cases, I don't really want to talk about Biden and Trump per se. I want to use them as illustrations, not the people, but the incidents I'm talking about, uh, of essentially the world we live in, where essentially we now have information bubbles we're compartmentalized into all these various areas. And if you're not aware of it, it puts you into a distinct view that's going to essentially make it hard for you to get along with people. Because I know this comes up all the time where I'll be describing something to a family member, and their response will be, "Well, how on earth can these other people out there not come to the same conclusion we are?" Well, the reason they can't come to the same conclusion is because they don't have the same information. Now, they may not come around to that conclusion at all, no matter how much information they get. But if you lack critical bits of the story, there's no way you can you can come to the same conclusion. Now, when the whole first statement popped out there, when Trump supposedly was calling white supremacists very fine people, I heard that. I found that very disconcerting because 2016, 2017, President Trump was not who I voted for. And even if he had been the candidate I voted for, I would still be very, very concerned about this because it's kind of an indicator that things might be going in a different direction. Or, that the person clearly isn't who they advertise themselves to be. And it really didn't take a whole lot of digging on my part to find that there is a secondary statement that follows some 40, 45 seconds after the initial, re, kind of restates his many fine people statement and then condemns the white supremacists. And it's like, oh, okay, well, this should be pretty cool to get hold of. But remember, this is 8 years ago, and there's still lots and lots of people who think this is what was said because this is what they were told. They're functioning off of uh, news sources that they believe they can trust, and these news sources have violated their trust. And to give you an idea how far out my mind works in terms of dealing with information, I still held out the possibility that the initial information was correct as reported, just because I saw segment that shows Trump essentially exonerating himself from the initial statement. Um, I didn't know for a fact whether there may have been maybe an earlier speech, maybe the day before, where he said that outright with no clarification, and then the day later basically went into repeat mode so that he could basically talk himself out of it. I don't believe such a video exists, but it's always possible. I always leave room for 1% possibility that something I hold to be correct may not be. And I also always go through and talk about, or at least in my mind, talk about, okay, what would make this wrong? What are the possibilities that, what would I need to see to prove this wrong? Because then what happens is somewhere down the line, when I see something that proves myself wrong, I've already recognized that it could possibly be there. And I go, oh, wait a minute, I need to look at this because I've already considered this as a possibility. It allows me to have a lot more nimble ability to jump around and deal with information, especially when it's possible to get all your information wrong on the first shot. Now, one of the things I weighed in the context of deciding whether that initial Trump statement might be wrong was the whole fish food incident with the Japanese prime minister. Uh, you, interestingly, I'm sure there's people out there who still believe this. Whereas essentially what happened is there's this point where the prime minister and the president are both putting out small spoonfuls of fish food. And then at a certain point, the Japanese prime minister dumps his box of food in and Trump follows. Um, and a lot of legacy media decided to deceptively edit this and make it appear that Trump just dumped the whole box in, kind of being a jackass. And something easy to believe, but what an incredibly petty thing to do. I mean, really, to basically edit a piece of video to make it look like he's a jackass when he's feeding koi in Japan, which are probably have some kind of big cultural value to them. I also weighed that in context with another report that came out that claimed that Trump had mocked a disabled reporter, essentially mocking his disability. And that was an interesting one because initially it kind of looked that way. And then there's some debunking videos out there that show that, in fact, no, it was the media who distorted the form of disability to make it look like Trump was making fun of the disability, when in fact Trump makes fun of lots of people using the same motions and voice. So, anyways, knowing that we had several false stories, basically, or at least what appeared to be very false stories circulating in the media, it made me weigh the information I had on the very fine people to know that this is 99% likely that Trump actually did say he condemned the supremacists. So, interestingly, Snopes at one point would have been considered a fairly good source of fact checking, definitely veered heavily to the left. Just a few days before the debate, they actually changed their original fact check as saying it was true that Trump said that there were many fine people on both sides, referring to the white supremacists, to changing it to false. So, reading their text now, it says, in a news conference after the rally protesting the planned removal of a Confederate statue, Trump did say there were very fine people on both sides, referring to the protesters and the counter protesters. He said in the same statement he wasn't talking about neo Nazis and white nationalists, who he said should be condemned totally. Now, consider this in terms of the whole information bubble thing or compartmentalization. So, let's say you're the type person like me who goes digging after information when something doesn't quite sound right, and you try to find out if there are counter information, things that or things that corroborate what is said. Now, that's probably a lot of work for other people, and I don't blame them for taking the same steps I do to find my information. And I'm assuming Snopes is still considered credible to a lot of people in the center and the left. So Snopes essentially had access to all this information for 8 years. And then suddenly before the debate says, oh, well, hey, by the way, we just figured out that what we've been saying is true all this time, or at least mostly true, is actually absolutely false. So anybody who's following Snopes or uses it as a reference would then go to it and say, huh, well, maybe I need to rethink my thinking. Now, a lot of people who got the initial information probably don't follow Snopes in a meaningful way, so therefore this didn't affect them. Their bubble is still unaffected. And of course, there's all some people who, even if they did see this and they did find Snopes to be a viable source would just say, well, I don't, that's not the answer I want, so I'm not going to listen to it. Now, what I find additionally interesting is that Biden still brought up the very fine people quote in the debate opening. That tells me that Biden and his campaign still believe that there's a large segment of the population who find this very fine people statement to have strong legs in the political arena. Now, there's always a chance. I mean, let's be honest, Biden's performance wasn't the greatest. He may have goofed and started saying something that he remembered using many times, because he actually claimed that the reason he ran for president was entirely because of the very fine people statement. And interesting, I find the timing of the Snopes correction, not only the fact that it's 8 years later, but right before the debate, um, that it leads to some interesting ideas, which I might talk a little bit in a moment. But uh, but this tells you the level of the bubbles out there. Essentially, you have the initial information, and if your primary source of information is legacy media, you're going to believe the information you got. If you're following various other sources out there that are, let's say, biased to the left, they're probably still reporting this, but some may be changing their minds at the moment. Uh, and if those are the sources you've been following, you would not know that this statement requires clarification. And I mean, this is 8 years ago, and the information's been out there the entire time. It's not like it's just suddenly been unearthed, it's been there. So I think the debate itself kind of lends to an understanding of these information bubbles as well. Now, for at least a year and a half, probably a little bit longer, we've been seeing, well, depending on which circles you circulate in terms of information, we've been seeing videos showing Biden's decrepitude creeping up for at least a year and a half, if not longer. We see when he gets into the mumbles, when he says incoherent things, falling, wandering off stage, looking like he doesn't know where he's at. Now, just to throw things into how I look at it, I fully realize that by changing the way, okay, there's a statement that police use called "lies like a witness," and it's actually doesn't mean intentional lying. It means a witness views things in a certain way, and you get things through the filtered lens. Well, a camera lies a lot too. When you point a camera in a particular direction, there are a whole bunch of different things going on all outside the view of the camera that you can't see. Behind you, there's to the sides, there's above you, there's beyond where you're focused, there's the area kind of underneath where the camera can see. And not having all this information can rob you of part of what you're trying to get. You can use framing of a camera to bring out a picture that's very honest, or you can use it to frame one that's kind of dishonest. So when I saw a lot of these videos with Biden having issues, I did believe he was having issues. I mean, he is old and he hasn't been looking sharp for a while, but I did accept the idea that perhaps I was seeing videos that were framed in such a way to make him look at his absolute worst. And media was, legacy media was going out of its way to tell us that's exactly what was happening, is that these videos uh, weren't remotely at all what was happening. We're referring to them as cheap fakes, meaning that they weren't created but they were misframed and cut, etc. No, and to be honest, that kind of thing was happening. I mean, in a lot of cases, they were making bad things look far worse than they were. But we had legacy media building up expectations of a sharp Biden who would be able to go toe to toe with Trump. The debate performance brought in high viewership, uh, uncharacteristically that we've had for quite some time. Now, part of this is kind of interesting because I would assume that some of the viewership coming in there, because I mean, I heard a lot of chatter where people were talking about uh, what might happen to Biden on the stage. So even though a lot of people may have been hoping that what they were seeing in legacy media was correct, they may have been uh, either secretly hoping or secretly dreading that some of what they were seeing in the alternate media might be actually true. One of the things that tells us that the debate had a major impact was the polls and the betting pools had a huge shift following the debate, which means that people's perceptions did get altered. I've lifted this from Real Clear Politics. This is their betting pool chart, and the betting pool charts tend to actually perform slightly better than polls. Not always, but they tend to. And I think you can guess the blue line going down what happened on that date, that debate. Uh, and so you're seeing a marked change in the perception of the bettors who believe that there's been a marked change in the perception of the voters. Now, so basically, let's look at the whole bubble system as we're understanding it. So, if your primary source was to the left or it was legacy media, you would have came to the conclusion that, well, yeah, Joe's old, but he's not anywhere near as bad as what they're saying. Um, if you were running in alternate information circles, you'd probably be leaning completely the other way. And as I said, I took things with a grain of salt because I always leave the room for doubt on things so that nothing completely blindsides me. But interestingly, and I don't know how many of you follows things that are going on X, but I was watching some of the people trying to explain what they were seeing, other than the fact that we were seeing a huge decline of President Joe Biden. And we were starting to see, well, Joe Biden had a cold. And just to give you an idea, that wasn't something they popped out after. Literally in the middle of the debate, all of a sudden, all these influencers started popping out talking about, uh, Joe Biden had a cold. They were saying things like, "Oh, well, you can't consider voting for a convicted felon when all Joe needed was a lozenge." And then we started hearing about travel fatigue, and the more current one is just one bad night. Now, you hear that kind of stuff, it's kind of far out. I mean, if you believe what you saw with your eyes, I mean, these are possibilities. I mean, maybe, maybe we just saw the absolute bottom worst Joe is, and he's much better than this. Uh, the other times where we're not looking at him as intensely as during this 90-minute debate. That's certainly possible, but it does seem like an outlier at this point. But when we look at the people who are still basically touting the idea of having him having a cold, travel fatigue, or having a bad night, you got to remember these people still have an audience. There are people out there who are shaking their heads saying, yes, what we're seeing, that's what happened. So I guess the way I want to finish this up is I'm hoping people try to be more understanding of other people's information bubbles. I don't mean you have to accept them. Because there's truth and there's not so truth. And you don't have to accept somebody else's version of things. But if you realize that uh, a bubble doesn't necessarily indicate uh, willfulness, like if someone's believing in a lie, they may not be believing in a lie because they choose to. They may not have any better information. Uh, so I hope you kind of walk out of this thinking of your neighbor, going, okay, this may not be entirely their fault. Yeah, they're kind of choosing what they listen to, but we have incredible amounts of biases we grow up with that tell us what kind of information we should gravitate to. And just because you may be correct a lot doesn't mean you're totally correct. And you should always leave room, like I do, for the possibility that the information you have, even though everything seems to point to it being correct, might not be. So I guess more than anything else, I'm hoping to tone down the emotions. If you realize that somebody else is having a view that it's really hard for you to deal with, because it either doesn't fit your worldview or it just seems completely wrong, don't get mad about it. Don't get frustrated about it. Don't get worked up about it. Try to figure out a way to maybe insert just a little bit of change into somebody else's bubble so that they realize there are other ways to look at things, there are other sources of information, and that there may have they if they really want to know what's going on, and not everybody does, but if they really want to know what's going on, they may have to mix up their sources of information a bit in order to get there. So I guess in the comments section, I'd be interested in hearing any of your thoughts on some of the bubbly information I brought up. Like, did you hear any of these things initially and believe one way and then realize, oh crap, that was wrong? And anything else really that's been going on in the last 10 years, like a bit of information that you took as gospel initially and then suddenly went, oh boy, I'm wrong. And how you got there, because it's the how you got there that's probably the most important. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, check out my other titles, consider subscribing. And if you know somebody who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.